Hey guys, I'm Jax and this is my spoiler-free review for the new murder mystery thriller film, Force of Nature, The Dry 2. Force of Nature is based off the book Force of Nature by Jane Harper, and just like the book, this movie is a sequel to the film/book The Dry. But this isn't a typical sequel situation. This is a standalone detective story where the only returning character is the main detective. In this case, Eric Bana's iconic detective, Aaron Falk. The Dryaverse, if you will. It's a bit of a Knives Out, Glass Onion situation. This film is Australian, and it stars Australia's own Eric Bana, one of the 7 actors in Australia to ever break it big in Hollywood. But now he's come back to the homeland. We don't call it that. He comes back down under. We also don't really call it that. He's in Australia making an Australian movie, and that is spectacular. This film, like the original, is an Australian film, and whilst Australia, unfortunately in the filmmaking department, is a little behind Hollywood in terms of everything, but it is good to know that the Australian marketing department understands the importance in this climate and culture right now of the IP. Because this film isn't just called Force of Nature like the book is. They know to include The Dry 2 as a subtitle to get people in who saw The Dry 1. I do not think the IP is as big as they think it is to include it in the subtitle, but they did it, and I like that because it creates a very hilarious and iconic title for a film, because Force of Nature, unlike The Dry 1, is not set where 9/10 of Australian films are set, which is the deserty, isolated outback, somewhere very rural, somewhere very hot, and it is always very dry. Very, very dry. This film is the exception that proves the rule. This film is set in the mountains, everything's green, everything's lush, and the film centers around a mystery of 5 women who go hiking out in the mountains, and then only 4 come back. What happened to the 5th woman? Did one of the other women kill her? Or was she killed by some kind of, I don't know, force of nature? And so Eric Bana's iconic detective, Aaron Falk, has to find this missing woman and find out what happened to her on this hiking thing in the mountains. But a storm is brewing, and the coming rains and a potential flood might make it impossible to find this missing woman. So it's a race against time. And unlike The Dry 1, which was very dry, Force of Nature, The Dry 2 was, for reasons I just mentioned, significantly wetter than I expected. But unfortunately, and I hate to say this, one of the reasons this film is wet is not sexy, iconic Australian actor Eric Bana doing sexy things and making people wet. No, there's just a lot of rain. Ironically, Eric Bana is very dry. Very dry figuratively, metaphorically. He in fact does get drenched in rain and is technically quite wet. Performance-wise, rather dry, rather muted, restrained. It's not a bad performance. It's not a bad performance. It's pretty much the same as the first film in his kind of portrayal of this iconic detective, Aaron Falk. Everybody's 45th to 79th favorite detective, the iconic detective, Aaron Falk. Detective Falk. That sounds mildly better. Aaron is just such a dry, standard name. And maybe that's what they're going for. And I know it's based off a book, but just... And I'm not trying to be rude. Eric Bana isn't bad in this film. Don't get me wrong. But I am being realistic in my numbering of how iconic and favorite detective-y Eric Bana's Aaron Falk is. Because we've got iconic detectives like a Sherlock Holmes, a Batman, Hercule Poirot, recently Benoit Blanc. Just all of them have like a thing, an iconic kind of visual style, mood, tone. They have something where you're like, oh, I'll just watch them do a detective story. And they can be the only aspect that carries over in all these things. And then so when you do that with Eric Bana's Aaron Falk, and I know he's from a film called The Dry, but does he need to be that dry? Emotionally, so very dry. I found his performance so dry and so restrained that I found it hard to really emotionally connect with him because I felt like he wasn't giving me enough. I just feel I can't connect to him as a detective. And there are some big, powerful emotional things that connect to his past and his family and his mother and just connects to this story. And he knows the woman who went missing. She's an informant for him. So there's a lot riding on like how he's treated her and put her in this situation and all these things that should be very powerful and emotional. And I just found it to be so dry, so dour, so emotionless, even though so much emotion is on display. And there's a big moment towards the end of the film where I'm like, wow, that's a thing, that's a moment. But I felt like I was observing it. I was like, that's a moment. But it didn't emotionally get me. It's just, yeah, for a film that is very literally wet with rain and the impending floods that could destroy the entire case, it's a fittingly dry film for a film called The Dry 2. Yeah, I didn't love this, but I didn't hate it. It's mildly engaging, it's interesting. I feel like if I watch this at home, my phone is coming out, I'm playing a little bit of Clash Royale as I watch, you know. It just doesn't seem like something that's going to fully engage with me, but when I'm in the cinema and I've locked in, it totally does. The sound design and the score are really effective in the cinema. The cinematography is spectacular. All of that is totally worth seeing in the cinema. But like the plot and the story feel very, and this is super rude, but this is just how I felt. It felt like a streaming like story. Like the plot and the twists and the turns and everything outside of the actual filmmaking, like the plot and the arcs and the character stuff, all of that felt like something you'd watch on a streaming TV show. And it felt very TV, where it's like, yeah, this feels like one of those shows where you watch 8 to 22 episodes and this is just one of them. And you're like, yeah, no, it's not bad. I enjoyed it. It was fine. But as soon as it ends, you play the next episode and you're like, another. And then by the time you've watched like 4 or 5 of them, someone's like, what happened to that mountain one? And you're like, I don't. The women hiking, and one of them was sad. No, they were all sad. Yeah, they had secrets. It's totally and absolutely serviceably watchable, but ultimately forgettable. Yeah, it's a strong 3 out of 5 stars. Not as good as Dry 1. I thought the Dry 1 was very good. I think the emotional stuff with his past and his like friend was really powerful and really interesting. That mystery, I was like, I need to know the answer. And then by the end, I'm like, oh, that's a satisfying and thoroughly interesting end. I really enjoyed all of that and it emotionally worked for me. Even though I think the twist and reveal of like the right at the end wasn't as satisfying, I'm kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. But that film, I think, really, really works, and I totally understand why it got, like, a sequel. This one, I'm not so sure this is going to connect with people in the same way. Even though I think maybe the cinematography is even better, it's just an area, like, you don't see in Australian films that often, so I really enjoyed that. And I genuinely feel really bad, because I love to, like, support Australian cinema, but, yeah, this really didn't, like, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was totally fine and serviceable. Pretty good, not great. It's a film you'll watch one day, hungover on a Sunday, and be like, that sure was 2 hours out of my day. But don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be super, super negative. I actually think the last 25 minutes work really, really well. Like the themes and the ideas that the film is playing with kind of come to a head in a really interesting way, and there's some really thought-provoking kind of things that the film leaves you with. I just found the first 2 acts to be like pretty good, but just not great. Everything felt like a little bit too obvious. Things and moments happened where characters would say lines and I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. There's probably better ways to do this. I think the best example is that Eric Bana's detective buddy, friend, work partner or whatever, colleague, and she is like, we gotta push the informant hard. That's what we do. We get results. And he's like, I think we might have pushed her too hard. Now she's missing in the woods. And it just feels, I was like, oh, that feels like that could be subtext, where it's like they say words, but the subtext is those very pointed things, just very blunt, very obvious. He's like, oh, we pushed her too hard and I'm sad. And she's like, we pushed them too hard because we must. And it's like, and there was lots of interactions and dialogue moments that were like that. There's like a character at one point who's drinking a beer and she's like, oh, I'm drinking a beer. I used to do drugs. Oh, I used to do drugs, and that I was bad. And oh yeah, I was a drug addict. And I'm like, I do not get that sense from you whatsoever. You're telling me you're that, but I'm not getting that sense whatsoever from your character. And so there were moments like that that just felt like, oh yeah, that's almost something. The film is almost really interesting and great, but I just think there are some kind of characterizations and moments throughout it that feel a bit like, just not overly like invested emotionally with all the characters, despite some very powerfully emotional things happening. Oh yeah, it's just, I hate it. I hate how much I didn't love it. I really wanted to love this. I thought the Dry one was very good and very interesting. It was one of those films where I'm like, wow, yeah, no wonder this is one of the 4 Australian films anyone ever talks about. This one, yeah, not so much.